Welcome back to Scene Recaps. Today we are looking at a sci-fi thriller movie called Looper. Warning, spoilers ahead. Make sure to relax and watch the video. The movie starts with Joe holding a pocket watch waiting for someone to get sent back to the past from the future. While he is waiting, the time comes when Joe prepares his GAT, which is a future shotgun used for eliminations. As soon as the man returns from the future, Joe eliminates the man that was sent back from the future. Joe proceeds to cut the cloth from behind the target's back and collects payment. In 2044, Joe works for a Kansas futuristic mob as a looper. Loopers are the people who take out targets that are sent back from the future, and the loopers have to dispose of bodies that they eliminate. These targets are survivors in 2074 and are to be eliminated in 2044, as the future has made tracking systems for bodies, which has made it impossible for the mob's line of work to be done in their time. The only possible way for the mob to execute the bodies undetected is from time travel. Later that day, Joe walks into a diner and orders coffee. After, he drives to see a man to pick up bullets for his GAT. He pays using the silver bars. A while later, Joe comes across a fellow looper named Seth and is in distress as his new futuristic bike doesn't start. So Joe gives Seth a ride as they head to a bar. Then they enter through the back door to visit a woman called Susie. Unfortunately for Joe, Susie is busy, so Joe decides to go and meet with his fellow loopers instead. Later during the day, Joe wakes up from his sleep due to repetitive banging on his windows in his house. Joe walks over to his window and opens it. To Joe's surprise, he sees Seth looking stressed out, as Seth confessed to failing an assignment from the mob. While Seth was explained to Joe that he didn't eliminate his future self. The old Seth that was sent back to be eliminated warned the young Seth about someone called the Rainmaker. And this person will take over the whole mob and close all the loops. After this, both Joe and Seth hear a huge bang on his door and see the mob boss and his henchmen want to capture Seth for disobeying orders. Seth pleads Joe to let him hide in his house. After a while, Joe decided to make a decision and let Joe hide in a secret compartment under his apartment. After, the mob boss bursts through Joe's door and points a gun to find any existing trace of Seth. Fortunately for Seth, the mob boss fails. The mob boss tells Joe that he needs to speak to another mob boss, called Abe. Later, Joe goes to Abe's hideout. As they begin speaking, Abe threatens to take all of Joe's silver bars if he does not give up Seth's location. Joe does not want to give up his friend's location, so Joe hesitates. But he later reveals Seth's location as Abe begins to give Joe threats. After this, Abe and the mob go to Joe's apartment to take out Seth. Minutes later, they arrested Seth. Then they cut an address into his arm and cut off Seth's body parts. Meanwhile, these effects begin to take place in old Seth's body. So instead of Seth trying to escape the mob, he goes to the address written on his arm. Unfortunately for Seth, he is eliminated when he turns up. Meanwhile, Joe is feeling bad, so he opens up to his friend Susie. He admits he was the one who got Seth killed and feels guilty. Joe offers Susie half of his silver bars to leave the city forever with him. However, Susie declines as she has a job and makes good money. The next day, Joe is waiting for his next target. He waits for the clock to turn to the right time and he prepares himself his weapon and stance. All of a sudden, Joe's older self is sent back untied and covered. To young Joe's surprise, he immediately shoots older Joe, but he deflects the bullets with the gold bars strapped to his back. Then older Joe throws a gold at young Joe, and then knocks him out. After this, Joe wakes up from being unconscious and sees a letter stuck to his shirt which says, "Hop a train out of town and run." However, Joe refuses and returns back to his home. A while later, Joe returns back home to his apartment only to find the mob are in desperate search of him and are looking to rob his silver bars. Then, Joe springs out of cover and fights with a mob boss leader. After, he eliminates the rest of the mob as Joe tries to exit the apartment, but he falls out the fire escape. Then Joe blacks out. In an alternate timeline, Joe kills his older self. Using the silver bars he got from working, he took Abe's recommendation of moving to Shanghai. Then after moving, Joe becomes a hitman to make money for his drug addiction and his crazy lifestyle. Since Joe is running out of money, he chooses to continue a life of violence to survive. Eventually, he meets his future wife and Joe marries her. Because of the help of Joe's wife, he ends up quitting his addiction with drugs and changes his life. But then, 7 years later, an event occurs where the mob catches up with Joe and invades his property. While this happens, one member of the mob shoots Joe's wife. They capture Joe, then he's sent to the time machine to close the loop. Upon his arrival, Joe manages to take down the mob and sends himself back to 2044. He then begins his plan to change history and evades young Joe, who is trying to chase him. Going back to 2044, Joe experiences actions that young Joe has caused in his life, which takes place on old Joe. Whenever every young Joe is hurt, old Joe is also getting hurt in the process. Eventually, he finds young Joe at his apartment. Old Joe ends up saving younger Joe's life to prevent himself from getting killed. Then old Joe kills the last member of the mob, and it will haunt Joe for his poor decisions. Meanwhile, Abe and the mob discuss a plan to capture both Joes in the year 2044. While this is happening, old Joe searches the mysterious numbers on his hands in the library. After, he prints locations of 3 babies that could be the future Rainmaker. The next day, old Joe meets his young self at the diner. He sits with his younger self to talk. While they both feel tension is rising between them, a young waitress asks what both Joes would like to order. After this, old Joe begins to discuss his knowledge with young Joe. After that, he tells his plan to alter history and to hunt the young Rainmaker in the year 2044. By doing this, old Joe will save his wife from death. As Joe listens, he sees a map from old Joe that he shows younger Joe. The map shows the identities of the potential Rainmaker. However, young Joe doesn't like the idea and disagrees with older Joe. Then he finds out the reason why Joe wants to is because he wants to save his wife from being killed in the future. As the gunfight ensues, the mob appears. Eventually, they target old Joe but fail to capture him after running through the field. Afterward, the mob realizes that they also need to catch Joe. So they run and try to get him, but Joe also escapes. Fortunately, both Joes escape with different pieces of the map. Later, Joe follows the location from the map until he finds himself on a farm where a woman named Sarah. Sarah lives with her young son, Sid. Meanwhile, Sarah suddenly hears an unusual noise outside her house, so she stops cooking and closes the door. As she closes the door in her kitchen, Sarah sees Joe outside. Sarah grabs her gun beside her and threatens Joe, but Joe refuses to show his face and hides inside her house. Evening comes, and Joe feels that he needs to withdraw, but he tries to calm and prevent himself from collapsing. But then, he suddenly sees Sarah outside holding a shotgun and is about to shoot a man. Joe thinks that Sarah's in trouble. So, giving him no choice, Joe saves Sarah from getting in trouble with a beggar who seeks food. Afterward, Joe throws up while Sarah slaps sense into him. Sarah then asks him when was the last day of his withdrawal. After that, she gives Joe water to freshen up. Meanwhile, Sid finds out that there's a man outside their house. The following day, Joe finds himself getting handcuffed after waking up. Then Sid, on the other hand, informs Sarah that he's awake. Sarah immediately walks out and checks Joe in the barn while she's holding a shotgun. Afterward, Sarah gives Joe the key to uncuff himself. However, Joe refuses to leave her farm and gives Sarah the map. Sarah then grabs the paper and reads it, only to realize that the numbers on the map are Sid's birthday and the location of the hospital where he was born. Without hesitation, Sarah shoots Joe 2 times. She guesses Joe is a looper, and Joe says yes. As Sarah calms down, Joe tells his guest that old Joe will kill all 3 children born at that hospital on the same day, not knowing which one will become the Rainmaker. Meanwhile, old Joe mercilessly shoots his first suspect outside his house. Afterward, he suddenly cries after killing an innocent child. Days after, Joe keeps his word to protect Sarah and Sid while waiting for old Joe's arrival. Joe then realizes that his relationship with Sid is getting closer, and he feels that Sid's getting more comfortable with him. Eventually, Sid confesses to Joe that he knows what happened to his biological mom, and Sarah lies to him. The following day, Jesse, a member of the mob, comes to the farm. He tries to enter her house by asking for some water. Sarah follows his favor and talks to him afterward. Meanwhile, Sid and Joe successfully hide using Sid's grandfather's tunnel. Later that night, Sarah and Joe begin coupling as Sarah finally reveals that she has above-average telekinetic powers. By that, she means that even Sid adopted the power through genes. Technically, Sarah is the sister of Sid's biological mom, and she knows how to control Sid's abilities to prevent using it. Joe wakes up and suddenly finds Jesse holding Sarah at gunpoint in the morning. Afterward, Joe tries to talk in peace with Jesse to release Sarah, but Jesse accidentally points out the gun to Sid right after seeing him upstairs. Sid then suddenly falls downstairs, and Joe tries to catch him. However, terrified, Sid kills Jesse using telekinesis while Sarah pushes Joe to go outside and save themselves. After, Joe realizes that Sid will become the Rainmaker and that old Joe will know about it. As Joe shouts, Sarah explains everything to him, but Joe pushes her and asks if Sid is the one who killed her sister. Suddenly, Sarah starts panicking because she doesn't want Sid to be killed. Joe tells Sarah to go to the city with Sid as soon as possible before old Joe finds them. Meanwhile, a member of the mob captures old Joe and takes him to Abe. However, old Joe breaks free upon their arrival at Abe's headquarters. Old Joe then becomes aggressive and kills Abe and his henchmen. After, old Joe goes to Sarah's farm to kill Sid. But little does old Joe know, a mob member escapes from the headquarters and follows him. And despite being shot on his right leg, he still drives the slat bike to kill both Joes. However, he fails to kill them as Joe manages to kill him first. The movie ends with old Joe catching Sarah and Sid on the road. Panicking, Sarah quickly orders Sid to run while Joe is still far from them. While running, Joe begins shooting them as he runs, too. Unfortunately, Sid witnesses Sarah getting shot, so Sid suddenly stops running and walks towards her. And when a bullet grazes Sid's face, he abruptly activates his powers again. But before he can react, Sarah immediately calms him down. Sarah fears Sid's reaction because he might kill her as well. Joe sees them from afar and realizes that Sid will become the Rainmaker if old Joe kills Sarah. So, to end everything, Joe commits suicide by shooting himself to erase old Joe's existence. Luckily, Joe saves Sarah and prevents Sid from becoming the Rainmaker. This has been Scene Recaps. We hope you enjoyed.